Labadiena visiems. Esu Laurynas Buzys.
Good morning. I'm Laurynas Buzys. I'm a chief specialist in the working group on future transport. We are now waiting for the Vice Minister for Transport. She is on her way. Let us wait for a few minutes and then we will start.
Viceministrė to jau prisijungs, tai paprašysiu visų.
The Vice Minister is about to join us. Therefore, I will start with a few technical details. Those of you who are not speaking, please keep your microphones off and your cameras off. But once you are given the floor, please turn on your mic and your camera. Thank you.
Labadiena, gerbiama viceministrė. Tai jau
Good morning. Our Vice Minister has joined us already. We are all here already. So let us start with a welcoming word of the Vice Minister. Good morning. I'm extremely happy to see so many of you here today, so many stakeholders who are here with us. I see approximately 55 participants. This is the second meeting of our decarbonization group, and we have two goals and two presentations. I will ask Laurynas to show one slide. The slide will depict the current situation, where we are at the moment, and then we will listen to two presentations and invite you for a discussion. As you already know, there are three stages in the decarbonization process, and we are in stage one at the moment. At the bottom, you see the part marked in red, which says presentation of the analysis by the consultants to the Ministry of Transport and also insights by OECD experts. This meeting will fall into two parts. BGI Consulting and their consultants will first make a presentation presenting their assessment on the measures that are applied within the framework of the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. And then we will listen to our colleagues from OECD, who will present their own insights on the topic towards climate neutrality by 2050, reform options for Lithuania, focusing mainly on transport. They will also share international experience, and all those presentations are extremely important for all of us. because we are about to embark on our second stage, and that second stage will involve suggestions on how to improve and upgrade our national energy and climate action plan for the coming years. That would be briefly it for introduction, and now we'll give the floor to our consultants, BGI consultants, who will present their insights. A few more words before the consultants start. The first part of our meeting will be in Lithuanian, and the second part of our meeting will be in English. So those of you who wish to hear interpretation, because we have interpreting going on, you're most welcome to choose the interpretation function and press the button with the Lithuanian language to hear interpreting into Lithuanian. And now the floor goes to BGI consultants. Thank you very much. I will share my screen and we will start. Do you see my slides? Yes, we do. Thank you. I'm Ustė Švedkauskienė. I'm head of research group at BGI Consulting, and I have a colleague here with me today. He also contributed to the analysis that we performed, and later on we will be able to answer your questions, should you have any. And I will now start with my presentation. It has already been mentioned that our goal today is to provide you with our insights on the assessment of the National Energy and Climate Action Plan, specifically transport sector. And when we speak about assessment, we have to explain what we mean. It is important to differentiate between the things that we have already done and the things that we will continue doing further on. Our initial goal was to collect information on 5 specific sectors and to assess the measures that are being applied in them within the framework of the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. And we also were supposed to say which of the measures are still topical, which are not topical anymore. And the information that we collected, it will later on be used in order to calculate the greenhouse gas related effect. And this information will also be useful for all of the institutions that are presented here today, including our social partners, because we expect that the joint project that we are about to embark on will allow you to see all the gaps that still exist, and you will be able to make your suggestions based on all the information presented to you on what kind of additional actions are needed. So that will be the goal of our presentation today. In addition to the information that we collected, we also did our best to assess the socioeconomic effect of the measures applied. And we took into consideration the effect of those measures on the number of jobs, on social exclusion, and other criteria and indicators. And certainly, every single measure could be assessed in major detail in that context, but we didn't do that. We only did the overall analysis in order to focus on the measures that will most probably have some kind of negative social and economic effect, and also emphasize those measures that will have additional social and economic effect, in addition to the reduction of greenhouse gases. And As a result of this assessment, we gathered quite a bit of information that will come of use in the future. Let us start with the measures that are being applied in the transport sector. The National Energy and Climate Action Plan includes a number of measures targeted at the transport sector, and we decided to group those measures into certain thematic groups. Of course, there are some measures that are promoting sustainable mobility, also ecological driving, and promoting the giving up on polluting transport, and also promoting the renovation of transport fleet, and promotion of renewable energy sources in the transport sector. There are also plans to electrify railway and implement other strategic goals set by the European Union. And our main aim was to take the National Energy and Climate Action Plan to gather information about the measures applied and see what is the outcome. And our analysis shows that there was quite a bit of financing allocated for the implementation of measures in the transport sector. And our analysis shows that the Ministry of Transport is mainly responsible for all those measures, and almost 1.3 billion were allocated for the transport sector. And the Ministry of Energy was mainly responsible for all kinds of fuels that are nature friendly, and for that transition 54 more million were allocated. And here you see the main sources of financing. One of them is the European Structural and Investment Funds, then Cohesion Fund, European Regional Development Fund, also Recovery and Resilience Facility, which also provides quite a bit of investment. We can also speak about every single separate group of measures. For example, the one focused on sustainable mobility. This particular area looks good, and a lot has already been done in the area, and some 233 million euros have already been planned for this particular group of measures, and plans regarding sustainable mobility are already being implemented rather intensively, and they are being implemented and financed from the funds that have been planned for 2014 to 2020, and also for 2021 to 2027. And here you see them all enumerated on the slide. All this financing will allow us to implement all the measures foreseen in our action plan, and some new measures will be applied in the future. For example, one of the measures is restriction for vehicles with internal combustion engine to enter the city center. It is underway, and there are also other measures that have been planned, but financing has not been allocated for them yet. There are also additional educational measures that are meant to increase the awareness of the society in terms of reduction of fossil fuel usage, and accessibility of public transport. Accessibility and usage of public transport is one of the measures that is not topical anymore, because other measures are compensating for this one, and the same aims are being reached as a result. Now, a few more words about the social and economic effect of the measures related to sustainable mobility. Certainly, the biggest effect is in terms of air pollution, and here you see effect marked in different colors. Low effect is marked in red, medium effect is marked in yellow, and big effect is marked in green. And we see that the restriction for the vehicles with internal combustion engines to enter city center could have a medium effect on the competitiveness of our economy. For example, if we restrict the access for such vehicles to the city center, in the short run, we might face certain challenges, but at the same time, we also see that in the long run, the result will be much better. We can also speak now about the second group of measures that is meant to get rid of polluting vehicles. And we see that the plans are to allocate 71 million euros for this particular group of measures. You see some measures that are promoting the usage of public transport, also acquisition of less polluting vehicles, and all those measures are being financed from various environmental programs. We also see that we have given up on some of the tax reliefs. Some other tax reliefs were introduced instead, and all of this also helps reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. One more important measure is the annual vehicle pollution tax. We are planning to introduce this measure. It has not been introduced yet, but we still expect that this measure will be introduced in the future. And one more measure, a regulatory measure that has no financing allocated, or is also on this list. What concerns socio-economic effect, here we see that the elimination of tax benefit, which was meant to reduce pollution, well, that benefit will have a negative effect on those who are working under individual business license, and the fact that this tax benefit has been eliminated might negatively affect their business, and some of them might lose their job. We would also like to draw attention to the fact that some of the measures might have impact on social exclusion. For example, the pollution tax or the registration tax or the annual pollution tax could also have a slight negative effect on social exclusion in certain terms. But we also know that when planning those taxes and those measures, this impact was already known and measures were taken to reduce this negative effect, but still it remains. And all the incentives for the acquisition of less polluting vehicles could have a slight positive effect in terms of social exclusion, but that effect will not be big. Some of those measures, specifically taxes, annual pollution tax or registration tax, they are meant to promote the acquisition of less polluting vehicles, and they might have a slight impact on the development of circular economy. We also see that they will have impact on environment. Positive impact on environment. Zero emission promotion measures. Most of the investment goes into measure number 13, that is the promotion of usage of electric vehicles, including charging stations. And this particular measure is being financed out of a number of different programs, including the Recovery and Resilience Facility and also the structural funds for the period of 2014 to 2020, and also for the period of 2021 and 2027. And this measure is a rather well-financed measure, and the financing amounts to 227 million euros. There are all kinds of sub-measures under this group, and various sources of financing being involved. Two measures under this group became irrelevant because of other measures that were introduced instead. And I'm now talking about T28 and T29. They are not relevant anymore. Now, what concerns the social and economic effect of the zero-emission transport, the promotion of electric vehicles, of the acquisition of electric vehicles and installation of charging stations will have a positive effect on air pollution, a major positive effect on air pollution. And we also think that the competitiveness of our economy could also have a slight positive effect. Well, this measure will have a slight positive effect on the competitiveness of our economy. Now, a few more words about the group of measures meant for the renovation of our transport fleet. And in this case, we are mainly talking about urban and suburban public transport and its renovation. And the National Energy and Climate Action Plan only speaks about urban transport and suburban transport, but here we also see some measures meant for intercity transport. And quite a big sum of money is meant for the acquisition and has been allocated for the acquisition of less polluting vehicles. Some 340 million euros have been already allocated or are being planned to, or are in the plans. And some money will come from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, also from the structural funds for 2021 and 2027. There is also one more measure in the area of public procurement, which is meant to promote green procurement. This measure has not been allocated any financing yet. Maybe there will be no need for financing, any additional financing here, but it will certainly contribute to the impact of the measures that are being applied. And here is our assessment of the social and economic effect of the measures. And just like previously said, we are mainly expecting a positive effect in terms of environmental pollution or air pollution. It will have a medium positive effect on air pollution, and the fact that new regulations will be introduced in the area of public procurement will also have a slight negative effect, indirect slight negative effect for the competitiveness of our economy, because it will take time for the market to adapt to the new situation, and competitiveness might go down slightly as a result. A few more words about another group of measures which the Ministry of Energy is responsible for. These measures are meant to promote the use of renewable energy sources, and some 22 million or close to 30 million euros will come from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. We also see some regulatory measures and investment support for biomethane or green methane production, and also the obligation for certain operators to use renewable energy sources. All those regulatory measures are already being applied, they have already been approved, and we expect that in the foreseeable future we will see the effect. And support for second-generation bioethanol undergoes certain changes. Instead of bioethanol, we are planning to focus on the financing of equipment meant to produce all kinds of second-generation biofuels. And this will probably help us speed up the effect, and already this year it is supposed to receive some financing from the Recovery and Resilience Facility. There is one more measure to support the introduction of new types of renewable fuels. It has not been implemented yet. We are not giving up on it, but we will discuss its use in the future. And here we also see a few more measures that are not relevant anymore. One of them is to promote the usage of renewable energy sources in the transport sector. It is not relevant anymore because it has been covered by or replaced by other measures, and there is no need to single out this particular measure separately. And there are also a few more measures that are not topical anymore. For example, excise exemptions or benefits, because we already have another measure which speaks about excise exemptions for first-generation biofuels, but seems like we do not need to promote the usage of first-generation biofuels because of the solutions on the European level. And one more, mainly technical solution, is related to the fact of the need to merge certain measures. And this third measure speaks about second-generation biofuels. And now social and economic effect. All those measures that are related to renewable energy sources in the transport sector have an exclusive effect, which is related to jobs, the number of jobs. And here we speak about the production of biomethane or green methane, and those investments, they are supposed to promote the expansion of certain industries and companies, and this should result in the establishment of a greater number of jobs. For example, investment support to biomethane production should also have some medium effect on circular economy, positive effect on circular economies. Some of them will also have positive effect, medium positive effect on air pollution, and also a positive effect in terms of competitiveness because of the investment that will come into sector and help establish new jobs. And now electrification of railways. Here we only see one measure that is being implemented from the financing that comes from social funds in the period of 2014 to 2020, and there are plans to continue financing this particular measure from the social funds in the period from 2021 to 2027. And we also expect a positive effect on air pollution, but no other social and economic effects expected. And here is a bunch of other small measures, for example, promotion of ecological driving, also promotion of combined transport use. And all those measures are already being implemented or have already been included into our plans. Some of them don't even need any additional financing. These measures are rather small, but they are important and are being implemented. And here we only expect some impact on air pollution resulting from the promotion of work from home, avoiding traveling, and there might be some indirect negative effect on jobs.
Dar keletas kitų priemonių, kurias norėčiau aptarti, tai yra suskystintų gamtinių dujų naudojimas, skatinimas.
A few more measures I would like to discuss is the use of liquefied natural gas. So far, the one measure is planned to be implemented in this area, and another one is not relevant anymore. So the one that is planned is LNG distribution system development, but there is no financing because the position of the EU has changed. So the financing cannot be allocated from RRF. So there is a question still that remains how this measure can be financed. And also another measure, support for LNG use in commercial transport, is no longer relevant because this type of energy, LNG, is no longer a priority. Another group I would like to discuss is support to the market. So there is 4 measures, and these all 4 measures are still in the planning phase. There is no exact description of these measures, and the Ministry of Transport has mentioned that they are looking forward to comments and proposals from the stakeholders. So we want to review this in depth and see and to assess whether this can be actually be implemented. To conclude, I would like to mention several measures that are still being planned by the Ministry of Transport. So the financing has not been allocated yet, but it's important in this context in general to see the plans of the Ministry of Transport. So this way we would be able to see what proposals you could submit, for example, in this area. So one of the possible measures is the purchase of new electric trains. So in general, electrification measure is already being implemented, but there is lack of electric trains. So there needs to be a new measure for the purchase of such trains. Another measure that is planned is zero emissions transport, heavy transport duty vehicles that will be purchased, and 2 more measures. So that would be more or less my presentation today. I hope that this has helped you to understand better where we are in the context of the measures. And I hope that you will find this useful when you will be submitting proposals. And in general, when we'll be improving the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. So I will conclude my presentation here. In case you have any questions, let me know. Thank you for the consultants for this in-depth information. I want to second what's been said. You will be able to read this survey more in detail on our website of the ministry. And if you have any thoughts, please submit your proposals. Now, I open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question to the consultants. Mindaugas. So there is a number of measures for the transport sector, but we noticed that the electrification of railways was not assessed as having a big impact. And in the end, you mentioned the purchase of new electric trains. So I think that maybe we could spend more time when assessing the electrification of railways in general. We need to have a strategic approach in this area. I also wanted to ask, when you were searching data, did you manage to find index or other indicators to measure the change in Lithuania in terms of where we started, where we are now, and where are we moving towards? Mindaugas, could you please specify when you mentioned the baseline? So what exactly did you mean? Which area? In the area of reduction of emissions. What you presented today, you showed what is being done, but you didn't show or explain how it is being done. So I think the next step is to assess how we're implementing the measures, the direction we're moving towards, because I think now we have the data of what we have, what measures are there, what policies are there, but usually the problem then is with the implementation of how these measures are being implemented in reality. So I think we need certain indicators to be able to measure the process and progress. So do you have a baseline indicator or indicators so that we would be able then to measure the progress? Thank you for your question, Mindaugas, and for explaining. So when we were drafting the plan, we first of all assessed the impact on greenhouse gases of all these measures. And we wanted to assess whether these measures are still relevant or no longer relevant. As you saw in the presentation, we specified certain measures that are no longer relevant. Our goal of this work was to collect data, assess the current situation, to see what financing has been allocated to the implementation of these measures, and then we will provide this information to our colleagues onwards, and they will be able to use this information to calculate again the impact of greenhouse gases, and one of the criteria will be the calculation of GHG. So this will help you assess the progress. Good morning, Mantas Butrimavičius from the Ministry of Environment. The consultants have already explained something, but as mentioned, the goal was to collect information about the status of measures that are currently in place and to assess whether financing has been allocated, whether there were any changes in financing itself. You can find this information about the measures on the website of the ministry. You can also see information how much is saved in terms of emissions because of the measures. And later on, we will be able to recalculate the situation. In the upcoming meetings, we will be able to assess the actual impact of these measures, and then we will be able to decide whether new measures are indeed needed. We will also take into account your proposals. So in the upcoming 2 months, there will be proposals submitted. We will assess them, and we will see what is the impact on the greenhouse gases, and we will be able to prioritize the measures. Mindaugas, if I understood you correctly, you've also asked about the measures that are already being implemented. So whether there is already an impact of those measures. So ex post assessment, according to ex post assessment, we will be able to see that, but this type of assessment will be done later on in the future, towards the end of this year, and we will be able to measure the impact of the mentioned measures. At the moment, we don't have such an assessment. It has not been done yet. We can see that the transport sector, that the emissions in transport sector are going up. That would be a brief comment on our behalf from the ministry. Thank you, Mindaugas, for your question, and thank you, Mantas, for your comment and for explanation. Now, I would like to give the floor to Rasa Užpalytė. Good morning. Vilnius Tech. I have a question to consulting experts. So certain measures cover cities. But why certain measures? Because regions also are important. So why one measure you mentioned was no longer relevant? This was to do with regions. Why? Public transport measures have changed slightly. So the urban planning measure has slightly changed, and now it includes purchasing of transport, public transport, both urban transport and intercity transport. So that would be the reason why the measure you mentioned is no longer relevant, because this urban measure has been updated. So this is a kind of an interlapping of measures. So one is no longer relevant because another one already covers the same area. So technically, we saw it was easier to implement just one measure that covers both urban and intercity transport. I wanted to add that transport vehicles is only one aspect that needs to be addressed and covered by the measure. For example, schedules. Certain public transport buses only run once a week. So this is a problem and this needs to be addressed. So one thing is transport vehicles that are needed. Another thing is certain IT measures and other measures. If I may, I agree with what has been said. We've seen that in the past, certain sectorial measures which do have an impact, they don't work sometimes. So, of course, we need to, first of all, promote the use of public transport. Just purchasing public transport vehicles will not be sufficient. So it's a much more wider measure. We need to develop the whole infrastructure. We want to make sure that people start using public transport. That is why we are dividing measures and their impact into subgroups to ensure we can achieve our goals. So, of course, just the purchasing of public transport vehicles won't be sufficient. We need to do more. And we will try to place into categories separate actions, separate sub-measures that need to be taken. So thank you. That was a really important insight. Thank you, Rasa, for your question, and Aiste for your insights. Now, I would like to give the floor to Kęstutis Starkus. Good morning, Orlen Lietuva, Kęstutis Starkus. I have a question, which is probably relevant to the presentation of the Oecd. When you discussed the measure on the excise tax reduction, you said that this measure was no longer relevant because we don't need to focus on excise reductions. But is it really only this type of measure only related to first generation use? When we reviewed as a working group the taxation system, we deduced that excise duties are vary. So my question is just simply whether the measure was properly assessed in the taxation of gas. There is gaseous fuels. For example, there is certain internal combustion engines that have a small emissions rate. So I wanted to ask you whether indeed the measure was no longer relevant. And also in the presentation of the OECD, I hope that the OECD will discuss the Swedish tax on carbon. So maybe we could learn from other experiences. Thank you. First of all, I will start and maybe the Ministry of Transport will step in to add something. So yes, this measure was, excise reduction measure was for the first generation fuels. And the ministries decided that this measure is no longer relevant. But of course, we can't say that excise reductions in general are no longer relevant. If you see ways how this could be used, then please submit your proposal and then we will take this into account. If I may, I will add to what's been said. So we have a working group, the Carbonization working group, and I think that this measure needs to be addressed by the energy working group, because this is a discussion about infrastructure and so on. Because this working group works in this area. As a transport working group, we are not directly responsible for this type of measure. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Thomas, and for the replies. Maybe the Ministry of Energy would like to add something on this matter. If not, then thank you. Thank you for your questions. Now, Tomas Aukštinaitis. Good morning. I don't have a question. I just want to add something to what's been said to the presentation and to the questions. So in the presentation, alternative fuel infrastructure was mentioned, and the financing of this measure and so on. I wanted to add, from our knowledge, we launched alternative fuels infrastructure financing as a separate measure, and we received a number of applications. Of course, the majority of the financing was allocated to the charging stations and the development of alternative infrastructure, which was related to liquefied natural gas and their use and so on. Another important aspect which I wanted to mention is the vehicle pollution tax. So what was mentioned, that it will have a negative social impact, this type of tax on vehicles. But I wanted to mention that we did an assessment, medium-term, long-term assessment, and according to our analysis, this measure does have a big impact on the transport sector, and it has an impact on the consumers. So we tried to do a preliminary assessment on the costs for the consumers. What I wanted to say, this negative social impact would only be relevant if the consumers chose to pay the tax itself instead of changing their vehicles. and reducing the emissions.
Bendruoju tokiu principu vertinant vidutinio taršaus automobilio pakeitimą į tą, kuris
So medium emissions vehicle could be changed with small emissions vehicle, and this would help the consumer to save around 1,000 euros just for the fuels. We see value added in this area, so this will not only help reduce the emissions, but also will be useful to the consumers themselves because they will be paying less for fuel. So this is what I wanted to add. Thank you, Thomas. Arvidas Galinis also has a question. LEI. Good morning. Lithuanian Energy Institute. I wanted to ask, how did you measure social exclusion? As the social exclusion is impacted by a big number of factors. Any measure that has been discussed today, in general context, this measure won't have a big, neither positive nor negative impact on social exclusion.
Neigiama ar teigiama bus įtaka socialiniai atskirčiai, bet aš vis tik tai norėčiau.
I wanted to point out that this, when you're assessing measures, you need to assess them not only in the general context, but you need to also assess those measures in terms of social exclusion, measure per measure. So what is the impact, for example, for low-income citizens? Now, for example, vehicle pollution tax. I'm not very happy with that tax proposal. And you said that this type of tax will have a low social impact, but I think this measure should also include positive aspects, positive impacts on, for example, social exclusion. But at the moment, I don't see none of those positive impacts on social exclusion. I think that those low-income citizens are the ones that get punished and taxed the most, because this type of vehicle tax is a big burden for those low-income receivers. And in general, those who receive low income often drive much less distances than those who are richer. As a result, the taxation burden is bigger on lower income recipients. I see a negative, a really significant negative social impact. Can you comment on this measure? Can the consultants comment? How did you assess this social exclusion, whether you assessed it in the general context, or did you look in particular measure per measure and assessed what type of social impact it has? So please comment on that.
Thank
you for your comment. We do agree with you, absolutely. This measure will have an impact on social exclusion, and all the aspects you mentioned are really relevant. If, of course, a person is able to exchange his or her vehicle with a less polluting one, they will do so. But those people who receive lower income probably won't be able to buy a new car. They will need to suffer then a bigger tax burden, or they will need to, for example, stop using a car. And this will have a negative impact on their life. So in this case, we assessed the measure in the general context. We assessed various factors that impact on social exclusion. we assessed what the impact would be of this measure. And we deduced that in general, the impact won't be as significant. Of course, we didn't have really detailed calculations. A few years ago, we did another analysis and we calculated more in detail to assess what society groups would be impacted. So at the moment, we didn't have an opportunity, a possibility to assess the exact impact in numbers. So as mentioned, the impact will be negative, but rather small.
Ačiū konsultantams, aš dar trumpai noriu sureaguoti irgi iš tą klausimą. Noriu visų pirma padėkoti Arvidui.
Thank you. I would like to briefly comment too. Thank you, Arvidas, for your insights and for your questions. I also noted down for myself some things to take into account. And in your question, if I understood you correctly, you mentioned that people with smaller income, they travel a shorter distance. Did I understand you correctly? If yes, could you please comment a little bit on that? What kind of data did you base your comment on, and how can we get access to this data too? You understood me correctly. I wouldn't be able to provide you with the exact source of data now, but I can look for it and find it, and you could also look and find it. I also have a simple insight. For example, we have senior citizens who have an old car which they use to go to their gardening lot several times per summer period. And there are also other groups of people who have new cars, but they drive to work every day. They drive their children to school every day, and they travel longer distance with their cleaner car, and it has a much greater impact on the environment as a result. And the low-income group is being impacted negatively greater, meaning this is not the most important source of pollution. I mean, older people, senior people who have an older car and use it very rarely. I think that you should also base the calculation of the tax based on the amount of fuel used per year, because of the example that I provided before. And thank you very much for your comment. We are now working with the Department of Statistics. We are analyzing the data of technical roadworthiness checks, and we are also trying to calculate the distances that people are traveling in various regions and areas, and we expect that this data will also provide us with better insights, and we will be able to come up with more details on those issues and deal with the socially sensitive issues better. Thank you very much. Thank you all for the questions. Thank you all for the research. Thank you, consultants, for the presentation. And half of our time has already passed. And now we'll start with the second half of our meeting. And now the floor will go to the experts of OECD. And our experts from the OECD will speak about climate neutrality by 2050 and reform options for Lithuania, in particular in transport sector. They will share their insights and also share the best practice of other countries. Together with the working group on decarbonization, our OECD experts are also involved in this project. And this will allow to have an outside look at our project, because our experts, foreign experts, they have a lot of experience. They are able to share international practice on how to achieve climate neutrality by the set date. And as a result of this project, all the measures that are foreseen in the National Energy and Climate Action Plan will be reviewed, and suggestions and recommendations will be made regarding the instruments that could allow us as a country to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And my colleague from the Ministry of Environment, Laura, would like to say a few words most probably, but if not, then I will invite OECD experts to take the floor. Thank you, Laurinas, for the introduction, and thank you for the active discussion in the first part of the meeting. We also noted that some of the suggestions, they are related to the activities and work of other groups. This is why I would very much like to invite you to register with our discussion portal and provide your suggestions there in order for us to discuss them all in detail. Laurinas has already mentioned everything what needed to be mentioned. The only thing that I would like to add is to invite you to avail yourselves of the opportunity to listen to the OECD experts, and towards the end of the process, we will have a wonderful set of suggestions on what to use, what not to use from the OECD. And now I'm inviting our colleagues. Good morning, and thank you for giving us the floor. The OECD presentation will be made in English. I'm switching to English now.
And we are pleased to see some of you who already participated in earlier workshops on industry, agriculture, and energy, and so apologize to those of you in advance. As you will hear again, the same introduction to the project. I'm Sigita Strumskite from the OECD Environment Directorate and managing this project on reform options for climate neutrality in Lithuania. It is part of the European Commission's Technical Support Instrument Initiative. So we would like to thank the European Commission and in particular DG Reform for funding the project and allowing this important work happen. I would like also to thank the Ministry of Environment and its Climate Policy Group for excellent collaboration. And we are very much looking forward to successful outcomes of the project that will also hopefully be setting an example to other countries in terms of its comprehensiveness of the approach to policy reforms towards the net zero transition. Next slide. So in this first part of our presentation, I will introduce the project, and then I will give the floor to my colleagues further on and give more specific details, and also with a specific focus on transport. And at the end of our presentation, we would like to share with you some questions for your reactions during the Q&A session. We are very much looking forward to your feedback. Your comments and guidance will allow us to prepare proposals that take into account the Lithuanian context, and it will help us make sure our work is most relevant and useful for the Lithuanian authorities. Next slide. So I'll start with the current situation. I will not elaborate much on it, as you must know this context very well. Emissions in Lithuania have remained stable since 2005, but we need to bring them on a downward path in order to get to net zero by 2050. Transport and agriculture are the biggest emitters, and transport emissions are still increasing. They have risen by 50% since 2005, mainly due to an increase in the volume of goods transported by road and greater emissions from passenger cars. Next slide. So following the new European climate law from June last year, the net zero greenhouse gas emission targets by 2050 has become legally binding in all EU countries. The legislation also sets a new target for 2030, collectively reducing the net greenhouse gas emissions for EU countries by at least 55% compared to 1990 levels. Next slide. So now the new national targets for the non-ETS sector and the effort sharing regulation are based on per capita GDP as the main factor, followed by cost effectiveness. For Lithuania, the increase in the target is important, from 9% net emissions cut relative to 2005 levels by 2030 to a cut of 21%. So next slide. As we know, the Lithuanian government has set high climate policy ambitions, which is in line with this overall new picture at the EU level. And it's very welcome to see that the national and sectoral emissions reduction targets are revised in the new NCCMA. They provide a key framework for reaching these ambitions. In particular, the target for emissions cut in the non-ETS sectors is at least 25%, so above the 21% required under the effort sharing regulation. But the challenge, and as it was mentioned in earlier discussions, is how to turn this higher ambition and targets into concrete policy actions that will achieve these expected emissions reductions, but would also take into consideration economic, social, and distributional aspects of the transition. Next slide. So this graph from the last year's OECD's environmental performance review shows data from the last greenhouse gas projection submission to the EU based on the current national energy and climate plan. The currently planned measures will not be sufficient to meet the new targets under the NCCMA. In particular, the increase in the target emissions cut for the non-ETS sector from 9% under the NECP to 25% under the NCCMA, shown here by a cross, requires additional measures. We can also see that getting to a reduction of 85% in overall emissions in 2040, as shown here by a triangle, will require new measures beyond those envisaged in the NCCMA. So we therefore welcome the government's plan to revise the NECP by mid-2030 and to make it consistent with the country's carbon neutrality goal. And this project will support this review. Next slide. So to start our analysis, we are relying on our recent collaboration with Lithuania, in particular the 4 recent reports. The environmental performance review, the energy policy review, the economic survey, and effective carbon rates. Next slide. So according to both the OECD's environmental performance review and the International Energy Agency's energy review, which both date from last year, Lithuania has made huge progress on the policy front, which includes the shift from natural gas to biofuels, as well as improvements in energy efficiency and new vehicle taxation. But further measures are recommended in 5 main areas. So these are fossil fuel taxes and subsidies, energy efficiency improvements, power system security and flexibility, bioenergy sustainability, and investment into energy technology innovation. Next slide. So turning to specific assessment and recommendations for the transport sector from the OECD Environmental Performance Review and the IEA Energy Review. So these reports highlighted improvements, as I already mentioned earlier, such as reduction in passenger kilometers traveled, a growing share of biofuels, and high rates of walking as a mode of transport. Vilnius, for instance, has the third largest proportion of walking as a mode of transport in the modal split with 24%. However, only 1.5% of Vilnius residents cycle. Also, there have been important policy developments, such as the new motor vehicle registration tax introduced in July 2020. Yet, as mentioned, transport emissions continue to rise, and they rise fast, driven by very much by old vehicle fleet, which is largely important from Western European countries, by growing urban sprawl, and also growing road freight. So to meet the ambitious transport emissions reductions in the NCCMA and the NECP, the OECD and the IEA made a number of recommendations, such as related to vehicle taxation. Specifically, vehicle tax could be replaced by the vehicle tax to replace the registration charge, meaning that tax should be put on distance traveled rather on owning car. Then phase out tax exemptions and update excise duty to reflect carbon content. So tax rates remain low even after reform, in particular for diesel. Tax rates for diesel were historically much lower than for petrol, and they do not reflect the CO2 and air pollutant emissions appropriately. There is also a need for better demand management, particularly development of appropriate electric vehicle infrastructure. And finally, there is a need for systems and well-being approach to transport that promotes multimodal mobility and accessibility as part of sustainable urban planning. So taking these challenges into account, and among its main deliverables, our project aims to support and inform the revision of NECP, and we will provide further policy recommendations for decarbonization, so that the transition is economically sound, but also socially fair, and this will support hopefully public acceptance. The last slide, yeah. So before turning to my colleagues for more details, I would like just to remind the structure of the project. So it will consist of the interim report that we are planning to prepare by midsummer this year, and to which we will include takeaways from this workshop today. The focus of the report will be on 2030 timeframe. Then we have 2 rounds of sectorial workshops. So this workshop is the last one in this first round, and we will meet with this group again in the autumn, where we will present to you the findings of our research and the interim report. And then we have the final report in which we will propose specific recommendations, and it will have longer term vision to 2050. So now I will give the floor to my colleagues. So first we have Asia El-Guasem from the economics department, who will present the analytical framework that we will be using. Then we have Kilian Reiser also from the Environment Directorate, who will present some possible approaches to transport decarbonization that were taken by other countries. And we have among us also Anasuya Raj from Center for Tax Policy and Administration, who will also be contributing to this project. And as I mentioned at the end, we would like to hear from you, but I would like to clarify upfront that we are only starting this project. So at this shop, we cannot provide any recommendations or advice what is specifically suited for Lithuania. We are happy to answer some questions related to the project, but will be more in a listening mode and to hear your concerns that we will then try to take into account in our analysis. Thank you. So, Asia.
Thank you, Sigita. So as Sigita mentioned, I'll be giving you a little bit of an idea of how we go about carrying out our assessment. So discussing our decarbonization framework. So next slide, please. So in order to carry out our economic and social modeling of the different policy options and pathways for Lithuania's decarbonization, we'll be relying on expertise from across the OECD. So we have several specialists around the house that can help us make sure that our assessment is relevant and accurate, and as well as the external expert consultants that will be contributing to this work. So the key building block for this analysis will be the economic department's newly developed framework to decarbonize the economy. And this framework sets out a multi-step approach to a cost-effective, inclusive, and comprehensive decarbonization strategy. So such an approach is being increasingly used by the OECD. So we use it ourselves, particularly in the case of developing decarbonization strategies in our economic country surveys. And to begin, the framework starts off by looking into a country's climate targets to get an idea of the sense of to get an idea of their level of ambition, and then looks into how they are currently performing relative to these targets. Then a very important step for us would be to map out the set of policies that are used to meet the country's climate ambitions, a little bit of the exercise that was done by consultants as well. And this exercise helps us to identify where there may be gaps in the policy landscape. Then we also look into complementary policies that can help alleviate some of the adverse effects of climate policies or reduce frictions in other areas such as labor markets and financial markets in order to facilitate the reallocation of workers and capital along the transition. We do underscore in this framework the importance of fairness and public acceptability of a decarbonization strategy. So we do look into compensatory measures and other interventions that can alleviate some of the distributional consequences of climate policies. Next slide. So zooming in on the possible policy instruments for decarbonizations, we think of them as falling into three categories. The first one is emissions pricing instruments. Then we have standards, regulations, and subsidies. And then we have policies that complement the climate policies and also provide a framework for addressing distributional consequences. And so why is it important to stress the policy mix? We want to do so because we think that it is important to address different market failures at the same time and reach different objectives, policy objectives, and also to exploit synergies and manage trade-offs among these different policies. So just to give you an idea, we know that high and uniform emission pricing is efficient and effective, but it often faces strong public opposition that makes it difficult to implement. And so there may be other things that we can investigate to make sure that we garner more public support. We also know that standards and regulations such as performance standards can be effective in certain cases, such as restricting and phasing out high emitting activities or technologies for which alternative technical solutions exist. And if properly designed, they can also contribute to the development and deployment of clean energies. However, these measures can entail high emission reduction costs. So they are not the most cost-effective types of instruments. Other instruments that can be used, for instance, taxes on polluting activities, such as the vehicle tax. We know that this can be described as having a lower administrative costs. But it's often used for other motives, like raising revenues. So they may not be as environmentally effective, given that they have other objectives beyond being climate instruments. And importantly, we also want to put forward complementary policies that will enhance business dynamism and favor innovation in low emissions technologies. And so we look into R&D policies innovation support and business frameworks that can facilitate competition and dynamism. We also look at infrastructure network investment, including transport networks, and ways to mobilize private capital, as well as, like I said before, compensatory and other measures that alleviate distributional impacts. Next slide, please. So one example of a country case where this kind of framework has been used is the Danish case, where in Denmark there has been a quite comprehensive policy mix deployed, comprised of several types of policies like emissions pricing, regulatory measures, and public investment. There has been also extensive stakeholder involvement, policies that are targeted policies to attract private investment, such as R&D funding, subsidies, and other means. There has also been a framework for labor reallocation, which ensures that the transition doesn't leave anyone behind, and other intermediate ambitions to render the targets binding and legally binding. And with that, I turn to my colleague, Killian, who will continue the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, good morning to you all, and thank you, Asya. So what I'll do for the final part of our presentation is I'll present some good practices for decarbonization strategies in the transport sector. And these are examples from other OECD countries. They're based on previous OECD work, research, and analysis. However, I need to caveat the examples before I go ahead and present them with the fact that we didn't choose them specifically based on their applicability to the Lithuanian context. So please excuse us if you don't find them all to be directly relevant, but I think they present a good, good examples of how countries have gone about decarbonizing in the past. So before I turn to specific examples from individual countries, I'd like to discuss some of the key challenges to decarbonizing the transport sector more generally. So first of all, decarbonizing transport comes with pretty stark distributional consequences. So for example, carbon pricing in transport is often regressive without redistributional policies, as all households rely on mobility in some form, and richer households are able to bear the burden of carbon pricing more easily than poorer households. Electric vehicle incentives could also be regressive. For example, subsidies for private charging stations often benefit those who already have the income to be able to afford an electric vehicle more than those who do not. And finally, transforming transport comes with a rural-urban divide. So for example, urban transportation may benefit from less private vehicles and more public transport and cycling, but but this is not always applicable in rural areas as they're not as well connected. And so solutions need to be found for both. A further challenge in the transport sector is the base erosion as fuel tax revenues decrease with low emissions transport. So countries need to long-term consider how to be able to find solutions to this base erosion problem. And one example here might be a distance-based tax. And finally, the decarbonization of freight transport or heavier types of transport requires new technologies. For example, advanced biofuels or hydrogen fueled vehicles. Now, as Sigta mentioned, one of the things that the OECD has recently written a report on is the need to address or to transform the transport sector toward low emissions or net zero emissions, whilst also addressing social well-being. And here, what the most recent report from the OECD found is that current systems of transportation, particularly in the urban sphere, are focused on maximizing private mobility with a focus on private car use. And the decarbonization approach within the system has been to electrify private cars. However, what the report suggests is an alternative approach might be more valuable. And they suggest a redesign of urban transport systems to focus on accessibility rather than private mobility. This would reallocate road space from private cars to cycling, pedestrianized areas and public transport. And examples of this sort of approach to transportation policy already exist. For example, in Finland, the Mobility as a Service program uses smart technologies to provide simple and viable alternatives to private car use. These are multimodal and will be based on or are based on public transport and micromobility such as bike and car sharing. And overall, this framework tries to be tailored to individual needs. So using smart technologies, the behavior of different users can then also be assessed and the program adjusted to best cater to everybody. Another example is the implementation of congestion charging in Milan, which reduced traffic and then had the added benefit of also incentivizing cycling as cyclists perceived to be roads to be safer with reduced traffic. So next, I'd like to talk a little about carbon pricing in the transport sector. So as Asia mentioned, carbon pricing within our framework plays a very important role in the policy mix, as it is a cost-effective means to lower emissions and also promotes innovation. And finally, also carbon pricing generates revenues that can be redistributed, which is a very important benefit of pricing initiatives. And one example that I'd like to discuss here is Germany's recent expansion or increase of emissions pricing in non-ETS sectors. So under the Climate Action Plan agreed in 2019, Germany extended a carbon pricing system to the transport and heating sectors. Initially, this followed a fixed price stage, so basically equivalent to a tax, with the fixed price increasing until 2025. This was then followed by a transition period with auctioning with a price corridor in 2020, or will be followed by auctioning with a price corridor in 2026, whilst transitioning to a full market price from 2027. And it's projected to generate 40 billion euros in revenue, which would, for example, enable a lowering of the renewable energy surcharge that German energy consumers have been paying in order to fund the deployment of renewable energy. Leakage in the scheme aims to be avoided through compensation mechanisms for emission-intensive and trade-exposed industries. However, under the condition that these firms invest most of this compensation in energy efficiency measures. From 2023, 53% of compensation needs to be invested in energy efficiency, and from 2025, 80% of all compensation payments. Finally, biofuels are exempt under the expansion of the ETS to transport and heating, but only if they comply with EU sustainability criteria. Now, before I move on with my other examples, as one of the questions from the previous presentation was on the Swedish carbon price, I'd like to give the floor very briefly to my colleague Anasuya Raj, who works in the tax directorate, and she'd like to just very briefly present the Swedish case.
Hi, thanks, Kilian. So I don't have a slide on this, but just to briefly touch upon the Swedish case. So Sweden was one of the first countries in the world actually to implement a carbon tax in 1991. And it mainly applies to transport fuels, so in the road sector, in order, as Killian just mentioned, also to avoid competitiveness issues in other sectors. So it was introduced at an already relatively high rate of around 25 euros per ton of CO2 in 1991, and then it gradually increased to reach a rate in 2018 of 125 euros per ton of CO2, which is actually currently the highest explicit carbon tax in the world. And simultaneously, in 1990, so just before actually, Sweden also extended the coverage of its existing VAT to include gasoline and diesel. And recent evidence actually suggests that this tax was very successful in reducing CO2 emissions from the road sector. So after implementation of both the carbon tax and the extension of the VAT, so CO2 emissions from transport declined by 11% almost, with most of the reduction coming from the carbon tax.
Great, thank you so much, Anasuya. And now I'd like to continue with some more examples of taxes on polluting activities in the transport sector. So as Asya also mentioned, beyond just emissions pricing or carbon pricing, taxes can also be put on fuel or vehicle use, which can help shift modes of transportation used. However, as I also presented at the beginning of this section of the presentation, this risks tax base erosion if not accompanied by other revenue-generating policies, such as the introduction of a distance-based tax. Now, examples exist all over the world for fuel and vehicle taxes. And examples in Israel and Denmark show that internalizing external costs, such as greenhouse gas emissions and local pollution in fuel and vehicle taxes, actually reduces transport emissions quite significantly. The Danish example is quite complicated, but I'd like to go through it very briefly because it gives it a good case of how these vehicle taxes are set up. So in Denmark, all cars pay a registration tax based on the value of the car. Furthermore, electric vehicles and low emissions vehicles get a tax deduction based on the battery capacity plus a basic tax deduction that applies to all of these types of vehicles. And in addition to all of this, there's also a CO2 surcharge that's based on the emissions per kilometer traveled. A further tax on a polluting activity is an area or a congestion charge. And the experience in Stockholm, again, one of the first cities in Europe to implement a congestion charge, shows that this drastically reduces traffic with huge local air pollution benefits, but also greenhouse gas emissions. Now, such area and congestion charging can also be combined with standards. So, for example, in Milan, high-emitting vehicles are completely banned from city centers, and low emitters still pay a congestion charge. And this has reduced traffic to such an extent that cycling increased very significantly. Finally, all of these taxes on polluting activities generate revenue that have been used to finance public transport. And there's lots of examples of this from throughout Europe and the rest of the OECD. Now, some of the complementary policies that can help support the transition to a low emissions transportation sector include, for example, subsidies for infrastructure development. And the transition to low emissions transport requires quite significant public investments in infrastructure, very notably, for example, in charging for electric vehicles. In Denmark, public procurement of charging points on main roads grants users 50% electricity discount when they use these charging points. Fiscal rebates are also available for private charging infrastructure, with private households able to deduct the costs of installing EV charging stations from their income tax. And a tax rebate is also available for electric vehicle users who charge at home. And similar incentives exist throughout Europe. For example, France gives a percentage of subsidies to the installation of electric vehicle chargers, and Germany provides grants to households wishing to install their own charging devices. A further example of an important measure that can be taken in the transport sector is specifically related to biofuels is the use of tradable performance standards. Now, the example here is the Renova Bio policy in Brazil, which targets a 10% greenhouse gas emissions reduction in the transport sector by 2028. Now, the Renova Bio program creates a fuel matrix of emissions reductions targets that are broken down annually into mandatory individual targets for fossil fuel distributors according to their market participation. It then certifies biofuels, assigning different grades to biofuel producers relative to the carbon intensity of the fuel produced. And these certificates, equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 avoided, can then be traded on the market. And fossil fuel distributors have to use the purchase of such certificates or the purchase of biofuels to be able to reach their emissions reduction targets. However, also the certificates are linked to sustainable land use criteria to ensure that biofuel use remains sustainable. Now, finally, I'd like to come to one last example, which is, again, on the need for investment in infrastructure and the sort of complementary effects of this. So the example here is the example of Copenhagen, Denmark, where over the period of from 1996 to 2010, cycling increased by 20%. And recent studies have shown that this is really down to a combination of policies specifically focused on making the experience of cyclists in the city nicer. And this includes investing heavily into physical infrastructure and building hundreds of kilometers of new cycle lanes. For example, also linking various different municipalities through super cycle highways that allow cycle transportation, not just within the urban sector, but they also focus on policies that increase the comfort and service to cyclists. So, for example, ensuring that cyclists get a green wave at traffic lights or granting options to take bikes on trains. Finally, there would also be policies in the sense of regulation, for example, norms for bicycle parking with commercial and residential developments needing to ensure that a certain number of bicycle parking spaces are available per 100 square meters developed, but also implementing one-way streets for car traffic, but allowing cyclists to use these streets in both directions and limiting parking spaces to ensure that there's more space for cycling in the city. And that brings me to the end of my presentation of examples from other OECD countries. And finally, I'd like to go through some of the open questions that we'd like to discuss with you and hear your thoughts on. So first of all, what do you see to be the key challenges for decarbonizing the transport sector in Lithuania? And from your view, what are the primary concerns considering the updated climate targets? And what policies do you think are best suited to meeting these targets in Lithuania? With that, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion.
Tai ačiū labai Europos komisijos ir EBPO ekspertams už pristatymą ir už tikrai labai
Thank you for the OECD experts for their presentation and for your work. I invite everyone to read more in detail the report, the initial report, and the insights by the OECD experts. This will help you when you will be submitting your own proposals in the transport sector. Now, I would like to encourage you to react to the questions provided, to ask your own questions, share your thoughts. Thank you.
Rankų nėra, tai
There is no volunteers. I don't see no reactions at the moment. So maybe we will finish today's meeting and we will have to do homework to analyze the data, the information more in detail, and maybe during the next meeting we will discuss it. By the way, Arvidas has something to say, so you have the floor. Good morning once again. May I ask in Lithuanian, asks Arvidas? Yes, you can ask in Lithuanian. I wanted to ask the consultants the following. You provided various measures, combination of measures how we can reduce emissions in the transport sector. I believe that, of course, we can use a number of measures, but we need to assess somehow whether those measures are effective or not. So I wanted to ask the consultants, what would you recommend? How could we assess the effectiveness of those measures? Because, of course, we can develop measures, we can project possible impact, but these will be only calculations. In practice, it can be quite different or entirely different from what has been planned. So how can we assess whether our measures, let's say we think the impact will be positive, but in practice we will see it won't give us any results? What is the problem? The problem is if we implement measures and we think they have an impact, and in the end, we can calculate CO2 emissions, but we don't know if it's direct impact of the measures or something else. How can we assess direct impact of the measures? This is the main question. Can you share your experience or recommendations in this area? Thank you.
Thank you for this very relevant question. It's very fair to ask, of course. So yes, in the framework, we do want to look at not only the cost effectiveness, so the costs that are related in reducing emissions, and this can be measured in terms of GDP loss or welfare loss, and etc. And also, and this can be used can be obtained through a modeling framework. So we can test out different scenarios for the transport sector through our modeling tool. But also we have a lot of experience on the topic from other countries. And so we are going to also draw some conclusions from cross-country comparisons or work that has been done in the past to say something about the efficiency and the effectiveness of policies. So that's our approach, is both through a modeling exercise, but also through different case studies.
Perhaps also to add to this, I think it's important to clarify that it's not necessarily within the scope of our project to provide ex-post assessments of the measures that we will recommend the Lithuanian government to take. So our project will provide projections of which measures we think will be the most relevant to reaching Lithuanian decarbonization targets. However, there are means that the Lithuanian government can take to ensure that the measures that they are taking have a desired effect, and most of those require collecting data. But for example, if you know that a certain number of electric vehicles have been added to the fleet, and perhaps a certain number of passenger vehicles with high emissions removed, then you can already through that see that a certain number of emissions will have been reduced. So you need to have the data of what kind of inputs or what kind of emitting practices are being reduced and by how much. And from that, you can extrapolate that the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that you see will also be from those measures.
Taip, ačiū už atsakymą.
Thank you for your reply.
Mantas norėtų sureaguoti ir kažką papildyti?
Mantas, would you like to react?
Gerai.
I want to ask later.
Ačiū už atsakymą.
Thank you for your reply. Now,
Klausimą Kęstučiui. Prašau.
Kęstutis, you have the floor.
Taip, sveiki. Kęstutis Tarkus, Orlen Lietuva.
Good morning, Orlen Lietuva, Kęstutis Tarkus. I have a general
Visais atvejais, kai visos yra priemonės.
Insight.
Dekarbonizavimui ruošiamos, tai
When the measures are drafted, always the first question
yra skaičiuojami tie efektai.
whether the methodology is used, the same methodology to calculate the impact and effect. If we talk about transport vehicles, so tailpipe emissions are calculated. There is difference between different types of fuels. Maybe biofuels have a near zero emissions, whilst biogas, 100% biogas has different impact from electric vehicles. So we have a different baseline for comparison. We are measuring emissions from the exhaust fumes. We are comparing different things. So my question is the methodology for assessment. We need to ensure we measure the measurable things. So we need to ensure whether are we measuring exhaust fumes, are we measuring in general the impact of the use of the vehicle? These are different things. Thank you. As I understand, would anybody like to react to Kęstutis?
Yes. So on the emissions from transport, I know that the tool that we're using is a CGE model, so computational general equilibrium, computable general equilibrium model. And that I believe uses the data from the International Energy Agency on emissions in different sectors. So this is the data that we will be relying on for this exercise.
Good morning. I wanted to react to Kęstutis' question as how we calculate in the Environment Protection Agency. We use official ITCC methodology, which is used by all other countries too. This methodology includes emissions factors per different modes of transport and different types of vehicles. These type of methodologies are used in all the countries so that the data would be comparable. We also use this tool to the calculation of the exact impact of measures. The differences between Euro standards you mentioned, currently Euro standards calculate emissions amount, because emissions amount is dependable on Euro standards. I hope I have replied to your question. So Kęstutis, maybe you have something to add, please do. Yes, I wanted to once again specify what I meant. For an example, electrification of transport vehicles. So we would use, of course, methodologies for the calculation of emissions. Another measure, for example, is taxation. Excise or other type of taxation. So in some cases, fuels could have zero emissions or minus negative emissions. But what is different is the type of vehicle and type of fuels being used. We, as producers of fuel, the problem for us is whether there is any point So it depends whether what type of cycle is being calculated of the fuels. So whether it is the fuels themselves that are being used or the emissions they produce. So this was more or less it.
Supratau, Kęstuti, ačiū už klausimą.
Thank you for your specification. I'm not ready to address your comment at the moment. Maybe somebody from the ministry or from the Environment Agency could comment further in terms of biofuels and the calculations related to biofuels. Maybe you need a few minutes, and meanwhile, I will ask a question I have to the OECD. I can reply, says Karolis. As for biofuels, we don't know what are the emission rates in the production, for example, phase prior to their use. So we calculate GHG emissions from fuel when they're used. The biofuel factories themselves, I don't know what emissions they will produce. So, of course, if they produce different type of emissions, then it can be a problem. That would be it.
Ačiū labai aplinkos apsaugos agentūros atstovui už komentarą ir man tai ir ačiū Kęstučiui.
Thank you very much for additional comments and clarifications. And my question would be, as we are concluding, we have a few minutes left. And I'll need to wrap up and provide some information. So last question now.
Thank you. So a quick question for OECD colleagues is about the policies that are impacting the behavior of people in the country. I mean that some policies that implement some kind of education or social advertising, and the impact of these policies. Do you have any insights, or what kind of policies that change behavior is successful in other countries?
Sure. So, I mean, I think perhaps just directly from my slides, the most relevant example would be this example of infrastructure development for cycling in Copenhagen, where just providing infrastructure that makes cycling attractive as a mode of transportation increased cycling significantly. So that's an important demand side policy. Perhaps another example would be the use of pretty stringent congestion and low emission zone charging in Milan, where a sort of added side effect to that wasn't just the reduction of private car use in traffic, but also that then changed people's opinion on cycling, because suddenly they felt that safer cycling on streets. So those would be two concrete examples. I didn't prepare any for this slide. I know that there's lots of research out there on other demand side efforts, such as educational tools or advertisement, and if that's something that's particularly of interest for the Lithuanian case, we're happy to focus on that, or not focus on that, but use examples like that also for our assessment moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Tai ačiū labai Europos komisijos ir EBPO ekspertams už šį darbą.
Thank you very much, dear experts, OECD representatives. Thank you all for participating in the discussions. And now I would like to briefly share my screen. I hope my colleagues will allow me to do that.
Taip, ačiū. Tai norėčiau informuoti visus, kad
Now I would like to inform all of you that we are about to start stage 2. On the 22nd of February, we are planning to have the third meeting of our decarbonization group on transport, and experts from the Environmental Protection Agency will present the greenhouse gases accounting measures in the transport sector, and then we will also want to discuss suggestions of specific measures for water transport and air transport, and these suggestions are of particular interest for us. Therefore, I would like to invite all of you to send your suggestions regarding water transport and air transport in particular. The Ministry of Transport received very small amount of such suggestions, which are extremely relevant for us. Please share your ideas. I do hear them all around being discussed unofficially, and I would very much like to receive them in an official format, so to say, and the quicker we receive your suggestions, the better the result will be. Therefore, once again, I invite you to submit your suggestions, and we will invite you to our third meeting. First part will be devoted to our agency experts, and the second part of that next meeting will be devoted to various measures that we already have foreseen in our National Energy and Climate Action Plan, and those that could be included. Rinas, I would like to add a few more words. You are right by saying that we really need suggestions for the transport sector. We only have 5 so far, and we would very much like you to be more active, because this is a huge sector in our economy, and for us, in order to assess all the suggestions in due time, we need to receive them as soon as possible. We are waiting for the suggestions from our social partners and from other ministries as well, because other ministries are also supposed to say something on the matter. We will compare the suggestions, we will calculate the efficiency. Please send your suggestions. And this is all your suggestions can be submitted to us through our website. Please use the specific section for that. Thank you very much to all of you for quality discussion and for active participation. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Geros dienos.